Welcome, everyone. My name's Lori Ashley. I'm from the Wilderness Institute here on campus. Thank you for joining us tonight for a continuation of the 26th Annual Wilderness Issue Lecture Series, sponsored by the Wilderness Institute, the College of Forestry and Conservation, and the University of Montana. Schedules for the remainder of the series are on the table in back. Next week's speaker is Dan Dustin from Florida International University, and he'll be talking about solitude and the role of wilderness in modern America. Please join us for that talk. The talk tonight will last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers, and we'll finish by 8:30. Tonight's talk is being recorded both for radio and for television. So our speaker will be repeating the questions that you ask for the radio audience. Also, please stick around until 8:30 as the doors are loud and disruptive for the recording. If you do need to slip out, just open and close the doors quietly. And now I want to bring Carrie Gunderson up. Carrie is a longtime wilderness ranger, educator, and field researcher, and she'll be introducing our speaker for tonight. Thanks, Carrie.
Good evening. It is my pleasure tonight to present to you Germaine White as your speaker for this evening. Germaine is an enrolled member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. She is currently the Information Education Specialist for the, see if I can get this right, Natural Resources Division of Fish, Wildlife, Recreation, and Conservation. She has served as a public program manager, I better put my glasses on, and education director for the tribes, and has also been a cultural resource specialist for the Salish and Pend Oreille Culture Committee. And my first lasting memories of Germaine was when I had the opportunity to work with her on the river honoring that happens every spring, where the tribes bring in all of the school-age children from the schools on the reservation for a day of river honoring. And I watched Germaine's demeanor and gentleness and respect for many of the tribal elders who are brought in as instructors for the students. And I just can't think of a better person to be in the position as education information specialist and spokesperson for the tribes. And Germaine has a long history in the Mission Mountains. She has hiked with her father all over the missions as a little girl, fishing. She knows all the good fishing spots. And then evolved into hiking and backpacking in the 70s, and has been an avid hiker frequently in the mission since then. She has met with me, along with other members of the tribal government, to go up into the tribal side of the Mission Mountains, sharing with the students the wonderful, poignant, and unique history of the tribal Mission Mountains wilderness. And with that, I will introduce Germaine White.
First, Lori, thank you for inviting me to be here and the Wilderness Institute for this opportunity to come and visit with you tonight. I'd also especially like to thank Carrie Gunderson for that quite generous and kind introduction. Thank you, Carrie. I'd also like to begin my presentation by thanking Tom McDonald, longtime wilderness manager, Lester Big Crane, current wilderness manager, and also David Rockwell, first wilderness manager. I've come tonight with remarks that I have borrowed heavily from each of them, from their remembrances and their writings. So I want to begin by thanking all of those people. Tonight I'm going to visit a little bit about the development of the Mission Mountains tribal wilderness and some of the ways that it's unique. And I'm hopefully going to try and answer any questions you have about the wilderness at the end of this presentation. The Mission Mountain Wilderness on the Flathead Indian Reservation in western Montana crowns a wilderness range unique in the United States, both in magnificence and in management. Rising some 7,000 vertical feet above the farmland and the valley floor of the Mission Valley, the western front of the range provides one of the most spectacular valley landscapes in the Rocky Mountain region. But the range is more than a natural wonder. It's the first place in America in which an Indian tribe formally designated tribal lands to manage as a wilderness. In 1979, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes set aside approximately 1/4. I want to say that again because that's so remarkable. The tribes set aside nearly an entire quarter of their land base as wilderness for all future generations to come. Imagine that, setting aside an entire quarter of your land base for wilderness. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit about the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. We are comprised of descendants of Bitterroot Salish, Pend Oreille, and Kootenai Indians, who traditionally occupied 20 million acres of land from central Montana all the way to eastern Washington and north into Canada. At one time, we occupied vast Aboriginal territories. But with the signing of the Hellgate Treaty at Council Groves in 1855, the tribes ceded the vast majority of our Aboriginal territory. We also reserved for our exclusive use 1.24 million acres, now known as the Flathead Indian Reservation. We also reserved the right to fish, to hunt, to gather traditional foods and medicines, and also to graze livestock on our Aboriginal territory. So we reserved some rights on the land that we chose to share with the visitors and strangers that were coming into our Aboriginal territory. In the words of then Governor of Washington Territory, Isaac Stevens, the treaties gave access to, quote, much valuable land and an inexhaustible supply of timber, and enabled settlers to secure title to land and thus the growth of towns and villages. He framed the radical changes that were set in motion by the treaty as purely and simply a matter of progress. But for the tribes and for many people like you today who were champions of wilderness that were yet to be born, the meaning of these changes had a profound impact. The very first, the entire concept of wilderness is the notion of a wild other. An other that was set apart from and oftentimes at odds with human cultures and settlements. As Luther's Standing Bear and Oglala Sioux man said in 1933, this is what he said. Let me read you his quote. "We do not think of the great open plains, the beautiful rolling hills and winding streams with tangled growth as wild. Only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was the land infested with wild animals and savage people. To us it was tame. Earth was bountiful, and we were surrounded with the blessings of the great mystery. Not until the hairy man from the east came and with brutal frenzy heaped injustice upon us and the families we loved was it wild for us. When the very animals of the forest began fleeing from his approach, then it was that the Wild West began." So to the Salish, Pend Oreille, and Kootenai Indians, the Mission Mountains were just a part of our homeland, another part of our homeland. They were distinct in their incredible ruggedness, but no more wild than any place else. The area could be crossed only through certain passes, used for millennia by different tribal groups. Many different tribal groups crossed over the Mission Mountains, and they're still being used today, as many of you here, I'm sure, have experienced. Today we use these areas for hunting, for fishing, for food and medicinal plant gathering, for other cultural and spiritual activities. And to our elders and ancestors, there was really no need for a formal designation of wilderness, because the traditional values of the people were to maintain a sustainable way of life. And we did that by never taking more than we needed, by never wasting anything we took, by always reciprocating through ceremony and offerings, and always ensuring that there was plenty for future generations who were yet to come. And in this way, there was never an exploitation of resources on the land, or a need to designate a place separate or apart from humans. But the marginalization of the traditional way of life of the people that had sustained them for millennia, there's recordation of about 12,000 years of constant occupancy of tribal people in our homeland, and many of our stories are the stories that the elders have told us talk about a time when there was a battle between warm and cold, and the final establishment of the seasonal regimes that we know today, and also the animals that we know today. So in our coyote stories, the oldest stories that tell us about our history and our relationship with the earth, these stories tell us about a constancy of sustainable life in this region. But the marginalization of that traditional way of life that had sustained the people for millennia began a rapid and dramatic change. With the passage of the General Allotment Act in 1887, it resulted in the tribal community land base and the beginning of profound changes. When that communal land ownership changed, that began a cascade of dramatic changes for the people. It was also a time where there was a disempowerment of the traditional culture bearers. And I think that disempowerment and disenfranchisement of the traditional culture bearers really was escalated by the building of the Northern Pacific Railroad in 1910. There were a whole series of historic events that happened, the opening of the reservation to allotments, and then the opening of the reservation again to homesteading. So there were fairly dramatic results that happened. So the period leading up to and around 1936 was really a time when it was almost unchecked exploitation of the resources on the reservation, and one of the lowest points of political power of the traditional culture bearers and of the traditional cultural perspective. But the Indian Reorganization Act, we call it IRA, of 1934, ushered in a different era, and really a much more complicated political system. One of the things that the IRA provided for was the election of a tribal council. The tribal council we have today, or the business or governing council, the UPAN, the 10 council members that are our leaders. But what that replaced was a traditional system that had been in place for many generations of traditional culture bearers and leaders that had been appointed by elders. One of the first attempts of the newly elected tribal government to officially protect the Mission Range occurred in 1936. It was during a period of extensive trail construction, or actually it was reconstruction by the Indian Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCCs. And there were trails being constructed all around the mountainous areas of the reservation. The Tribal Council voted to set aside 100,000 acres of land to form an Indian National Park. The tribes were to retain all land ownership and all management of the park. The main goal of this new tribal council was to encourage tribal members to come into the park and camp and guide visitors into the wilderness area. It was meant to promote economic opportunity and really provide guests and visitors an opportunity to be guided into the park. Nothing ever really came of this tribal council action. It died in Washington, D.C. at the office of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who were entrusted with carrying out the federal government's trust responsibility for tribal government. As tribal nations, we have an interesting relationship with the federal government. It's not exactly uncle, like I think the dominant culture calls the government Uncle Sam. It's more like it's not exactly like father, but it's a very curious relationship where they assume trust responsibilities for tribes. So nothing came of this action in Washington, but ironically, just a year later, the same Office of Indian Affairs classified the Mission Range as a roadless area. But the Tribal Council objected to this because they hadn't been consulted, they hadn't had any input, and the council was concerned that this really constituted a taking. So they opposed the establishment of the Mission Range roadless area, and it was declassified in the Federal Register in 1959. During the mid-70s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Flathead Agency was proposing large-scale timber harvests. There were huge timber harvests and multiple timber harvests queued up on the reservation each year. And they were proposing timber sales in the Mission Range on behalf of the tribes. In 1 year, in 1974, I believe it was, there were 30 logging units that were proposed in the missions. And in the February 1975 issue of the Charcusta News, the tribal newspaper, the timber sales included Valley Creek unit at 81.3 million board feet, Granjo unit at 77.2 million board feet, Boulder unit at 51.8, which was on the north end of the missions, and Rive unit at 40 million board feet. The smallest timber sale was 1 million board feet. Most of the 30 were the proposed 30 timber sales that had occurred in 1974 were actually in the 20, 30, and 40 million board feet size, and a large portion of these timber sales were bringing more than 50% virgin timber out of off the reservation. The Ashley timber sale was proposed, and it fueled a renewed interest in preserving the Mission Mountains in a natural state, and really to maintain the cultural and traditional values of the mission. As a result, in part of the Ashley timber sale, the Tribal Council decided to set aside approximately 91,778 acres as a tribal wilderness in 1979. But let me back up and tell you a little bit about that, about how the Ashley logging unit played into the establishment of the Mission Mountains wilderness. The action really came about in no small part by 3 sisters who were grandmothers. They were called yayats on our reservation, and they raised concern about the proposed logging unit. And they added support to the community leaders that had already organized a Save the Missions Mountain Committee. And the basic the basic interest of the Save the Mission Mountains committee was to stop the proposed timber sale in the missions. So it was soon after the Yayas intervened that the council seriously began to consider some type of wilderness protection. But the role that the three Yayas played in protecting the Mission Mountains from logging really deserves telling, because it's an example of how the tribal political process operates. So the Save the Mission Mountains committee learned that the council had passed resolution 4650, the Ashley Logging Unit, in early August of 1975. And so I borrowed my boss's Suburban and went to the houses of Annie Pierre, Christine Woodcock, and Louise McDonald and asked them if they would come with me to Dixon to the tribal agency and meet with the tribal council. And mercifully, they said yes. So we carefully loaded them into the Suburban and drove to Dixon. And on the route, I talked with them a little bit about the size and scope of the proposed timber sales and what had happened up until that time and what the Save the Missions committee had really been up to. And we arrived at the tribal council chambers, and the tribal council seemed quite surprised to see the three Yayas together in one place. And of course, rarely did you see these three Yayas together unless it was a fairly large or significant cultural gathering or event. So the councilman greeted the elders with deference and respect and stopped their business meeting and asked if there was something that they could do for them. So one by one, each of the women spoke about the Mission Mountains, and they talked about our responsibility as tribal people, not just to our past and to our present, but for all future generations yet to come. They also spoke at length about and they reminded the council with a shaking of the finger, you boys need to remember that we have a cultural obligation to maintain a relationship with the natural world that sustained us. We have this obligation to our traditional way of life. They further reminded the tribal council of the traditional values that really had allowed us to live a sustainable lifestyle from the very beginning of time. When the Yayats finished, the council sat there in silence. The council then thanked us, and we were dismissed, but the Yayas remained seated. The chairman asked if there was anything else, and one of the Yayas said, "Yes, we'll wait until you vote." So the councilman looked across from one to the other, and finally the chairman called for a vote, and one by one each of them recorded their vote, and the vote was 6 in favor, 2 opposed, and 2 abstention. And the tribal council, Thomas Bearhead Swaney made the motion to go back to the original plan of 1 million board feet and to try and find a clean way of logging, not creating more roads, not creating more damage. I was so happy. I was incredibly happy. And I realized that I had seen real political power and strategy at work in the most gentle and subtle way. To this day, I'm never going to forget the political lesson that I learned at the hands of the Yayas. So the Save the Mission Mountains committee you know, our main aim was to just save the missions. And we proposed a boundary that went all the way to the valley floor, and it included not only tribal land, but private land and roaded areas. And our proposal was really politically impossible. Our interest to maintain a wilderness area, to maintain the face of the missions without being significantly scarred by logging, was really the Yaya's desire. And we didn't want to see large-scale clear cuts. We wanted to maintain the natural and cultural resources of the wilderness for all future generations. So after that, several proposals were advanced, and all of them really lacked overall management direction and considerations, other than we just wanted to stop logging on the face of the missions. One proposal considered the least amount of land available for wilderness and really maximize timber harvest in the roaded areas. There were advocates of this proposal that were concerned about loss of income from reduced commercial timber harvest. So in 1976, at the recommendation of Thurman Trosper, who was a tribal member, a retired Forest Service employee, a past president of the Wilderness Society, the Tribal Council contracted with the Wilderness Institute at the University of Montana to develop a draft boundary and management proposal for the Mission Mountains. 2 years later, the Institute presented the draft to the council for review, and the council took no immediate action. But the Institute's management plan and boundary remained in place and remained under review. And a year later, it was approved by the Tribal Council, and the Tribal Council also decided to create a new tribal program to oversee interim management of the area. So this program, called the Wildland Recreation Program, was charged with developing a wilderness management plan and provide policy, and the Tribal Council wanted to see policy, and they would provide personnel. So this was an extraordinarily forward-thinking move on part of the Tribal Council. The Wildland Recreation Program, the newly formed Wildland Recreation Program, completed the plan in the spring of 1982. And on June 15th, the council voted overwhelmingly to approve Ordinance 79A, the establishment of the Mission Mountains Tribal Wilderness. And in many ways, as I said earlier, the council's action was really historic, because they decided of its own accord, of the tribe's own accord, to set aside a sizable portion of their land and manage it as a wilderness. They also provided policy and personnel to fulfill that proposal. The first section of the Tribal Wilderness Ordinance states that wilderness has played a paramount role in shaping the character of the people and the culture of the Salish and Kootenai tribes. It is the essence of traditional Indian religion and has served the Indian people and the culture of the Salish and Kootenai tribes as a place to hunt, as a place to gather medicinal herbs and roots, as a spiritual use area, as a sanctuary, and in countless other ways for thousands of years. Because maintaining an enduring resource of wilderness is vitally important to the people of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes and the perpetuation of their culture, there is hereby established a Mission Mountains Tribal Wilderness Area, and this area described herein shall be administered to protect and to preserve wilderness values. In June of 1981, the Tribal Council continued its historic precedent by following through with specific management actions to fulfill the wilderness mandate. A Mission Mountain grizzly bear management area was established to provide further care for the wilderness, one of the wilderness's greatest resource. A 10,000-acre grizzly bear management area. And you can see it on the map. I brought a copy of the wilderness map, and you're welcome to come up and look at it afterwards. The grizzly bear management area is closed to humans from July 15th to October 1 of each year to protect grizzly bear, critical grizzly bear habitat, and to maximize visitor safety. Now, a Freudian slip, I'm sorry about that. We really want to maximize visitor safety, but we also want to ensure that there's critical grizzly bear habitat. And you know, the relationship between grizzly bear and the establishment of the Mission Mountain Wilderness has really been largely underrepresented and misunderstood. I believe, in large part, the creation of the Mission Mountains Tribal Wilderness is a consequence of the tribe's desire to protect grizzly bears. I think this is a huge piece of why it is that we actually do have a wilderness. The concern for protection of grizzly bears was really heightened by a number of landowners who lived in prime grizzly bear habitat at the very toe of the missions. There were a few ranchers and farmers that lived on non-tribal lands adjacent to riparian areas, and they repeatedly called tribal game wardens and wilderness managers. They asked them to come and remove or eliminate grizzly bears from their property. So at the urging of tribal wildlife biologists, at the urging of the wilderness manager and Pat Left Hand, tribal Kootenai cultural leader and advisor, the council formally prohibited hunting of grizzly bears. That was the first step they made, to prohibit hunting of grizzly bears by tribal members. Pat Left Hand reminded the tribal council that we have never had a cultural practice of hunting grizzly bears. They're not our food. We're subsistence hunters. We hunt to provide for our basic needs, and grizzly bears are not our food. Also, they're leaders of the animals. They're important in their relationship with the animals to us culturally. And so all of this guidance, combined with the guidance of Pat Left Hand, our Kootenai cultural advisor at that time, and the game wardens and the wilderness manager, really prompted the council to take action to establish a law to prohibit hunting of grizzly bears on the reservation. But elsewhere in the state, as recently as the late 1970s, the state of Montana allowed hunting of grizzly bears. This was really additional motivation for tribes to provide additional protection for grizzly bears on the reservation. In the late 1970s, there had been a very high mortality of grizzly bears. It was reported in 1 year alone there were 14 grizzly bears that were shot and killed. A Mission Mountains Tribal Fire Management Plan was also developed in 1985 to facilitate reintroduction of natural fire to the wilderness ecosystem. The Fire Management Plan lists, here are just a couple of the objectives. Demonstrate that fire is a natural and essential component of wilderness ecosystems. Maintenance of plant and animal relationships that have evolved with fire. Maintenance of vegetative mosaics resulting from fire. But Indian use of fire and its role in maintaining a rich and diverse cultural landscape has also been misunderstood. The landscape that European Americans first saw when they traveled west of the Mississippi was not a wilderness. in the fact that it was separate from humans. It was a landscape, it was a cultural landscape, a landscape that had been shaped and maintained by tribal people for millennia, and probably the most powerful tool that they had used to shape the landscape was fire. It's curious that the first visitors and strangers that came to this area saw it as exquisitely beautiful, they saw it as rich and diverse, but they didn't make the link between tribal people and fire. And it was really the fire that they feared that was in large part responsible for shaping that landscape. The extent to which Indian people have used fire has, as a land management tool has really, it's interesting because imagine thousands of years of shaping and maintaining a cultural landscape. It takes a really long time to produce huge old pine forests with park-like settings in much of the prairie land. It takes thousands of years to maintain that, and yet tribal people who had used fire to shape and maintain the landscape, that whole part of the conversation has largely been left out of the discussion. There's now an ongoing debate about fire exclusion, what's happened after 100 or more years of fire exclusion from the landscape, and yet tribal people have largely not been included in that conversation, that public conversation about fire. So it's tremendous knowledge that the elders and culture bearers have about traditional use of fire, and again, it's really interesting that as fire managers are now attempting to return fire to the landscape, that yet still this conversation excludes tribal people. But the tribes, for example, have taken some different action. We recently completed an ecosystem management plan, and it calls for large-scale reintroduction of fire through prescribed fire. Additionally, the Mission Mountains buffer zone is another unique attribute to the wilderness. In 1986, the tribe set aside approximately 23,000 acres of tribal land as a cushion to the wilderness. I think this is, it was designated to control, to the extent possible, those activities that would have an adverse impact on tribal wilderness and cause erosion to the primary purpose of the wilderness. The intent of the plan was to establish natural resource management practices within the buffer zone that would cushion the wilderness from things like housing construction, density of housing in the buffer zone, and additionally recreation development that might have an impact on the buffer zone. So there will be no new trail construction, no new trailheads in the buffer zone or the wilderness. That there's been a cap put on that through the buffer zone, and really the desire of the buffer zone is to maintain maximum wilderness integrity. The overall goal of the buffer zone is to, quote, protect and preserve the integrity of the tribal wilderness. And additionally, the tribes have also encouraged other jurisdictions and individuals to manage private lands in the buffer zone on an ecosystem basis, to begin to think larger about their property in the buffer zone. Tom McDonald, as I said, was longtime former wilderness manager. And this is what he said about wilderness, the Mission Mountains tribal wilderness. Wilderness is, to a segment of the tribal population, vitally important. It is one part of the Indian culture that remains today as it has always been. Management and maintenance of the wilderness expresses reverence for the land and its community of life, as well as respect for Indian culture. So while the Mission Mountain wilderness covers approximately 91,778 acres. It ranges in elevation from the valley floor to nearly 10,000 feet at the mountain peaks. It's approximately 34 miles long and averages 5 miles wide. It extends from Moss Peak on the north end of the reservation and the Jocko-Seeley Road on the south end. Features include forested slopes and high mountain valleys, rocky cliffs, rugged rocky peaks, subalpine and alpine lakes, creeks, and some small glaciers. There are 9 major watersheds and drainages in the wilderness. In addition, approximately 113 lakes greater than 1 acre in size in the Cirque basins created by the glaciers that formed this ancient tribal landscape. But the Mission Mountains, the buffer zone, the grizzly bear management area, and the closure are all reflections of traditional tribal values, and they're a reflection of that connection between people and place. And I believe that's the critical difference between the Mission Mountains tribal wilderness. Thank you. Okay, so I'm hoping that some of you have questions, and I brought incentives. I brought gifts. So come on, you guys, help me out here. Gifts. Yes.
Why do you think that when we talk about introducing fire on other wilderness areas, have tribal cultural advisors with this knowledge of fire in the landscape not been consulted?
That's a great question. The question has to do with why I believe that with all of the discussion about fire and wilderness areas and other areas across the nation, particularly, and I'm adding particularly in the Northern Rockies, why it is that that tribal people have not been consulted. And I think that's a great question, and I could talk all night about fire. I love fire. I have a drip torch in my car. No, I don't really, but I love the smell of napalm in the morning. No, I'm kidding. But I really do like fire, and I have thought about fire a great deal, and am actually working on a fire education project, and that is the central question. And I think that one of the curious things is that for tribal people, our relationship with fire is very different. The earliest stories about fire are a coyote story, Beaver Steals Fire, and it's a story about how fire is a gift from the Creator brought by the animals to make this place fit for human beings who are yet to come. Imagine that. And so tribal people are setting fire all over the place. You know, I mean, we're making fire. We use fire in warfare, both offensively and defensively. We use it to make hunting, in creation of surrounds and game drives. We use it for cooking, for warming ourselves in all of our spiritual practices. We use fire to keep trails open and to keep camps clear, to keep pests and biting insects away from animals. We use, so I could go on, but needless to say, fire is a profoundly important part of our way of life. So imagine what happens when visitors and strangers come from a built environment where fire is really associated with destruction and ruin, and also many of the people that came were Europeans that came with a Christian tradition, and fire is associated with hell, with brimstone. So it was a potent collision of cultures, and I think that when they first came, as I said, they saw it as a stunningly beautiful landscape, but they didn't make the connect between all of the fire that Indian people were setting and this fire-dependent landscape. So my sense is that just there isn't a great deal of understanding that tribal people have this extraordinarily long relationship with fire. And now as fire managers think about it, you know, it's much more complicated than just flipping the switch off 150 years ago and going back in and flipping the switch back on and making fire. I mean, it's hugely complicated. And so fire scientists are really looking at it, but they're not, I don't think there's a large understanding about traditional science and how there were people that had a responsibility for making fire within our culture, and how a lot of that traditional knowledge and ways of knowing has really been maintained. So I'm here to talk to you guys about fire, right? You get it. And talk to us, because we have a long history of relationship with fire. So you guys are going to be the next fire managers, and you'll talk with us, right? Yeah. Well, yes.
You talked about the buffer zone on one side of the tribal wilderness, but how do you work with that big landowner on the other side of the divide in order to ensure that the values and the meanings that you guys have attached to your side of the landscape stay intact?
Great question. Todd Mann, would you help me, please? I want to give these, I brought copies of our regulations, and this is there's all the information about Mission Mountain Wilderness regulations. So would you make sure that everybody that asks a question gets one of these, please? So the young lady up here, would you raise your hand so he'll bring you a copy of that? Yeah, please do. Grab them all. Pass them out generously. Okay, thank you. So you had a great question over here. But I have a middle-aged brain, and I've forgotten part of it because I had to circle back to this. So you're asking us about how we have managed. I've talked with you a little bit about how we've managed our wilderness, created a buffer zone, established
on one edge of the wilderness
on
boundary, but what about that big landowner who
the
manages
Forest
the other
Service.
edge?
Yes. Great question. Good question. So Todd, honey, would you give her regulations, please, for asking the good question? You know, we have established a program where we have tribal staff, our wildland recreation program that works very collaboratively with the Forest Service. And Carrie was a long time wilderness ranger, and she worked with Sergeant Espinosa. Raise your hand, would you? Thank you. And they worked very collaboratively to ensure that there was seamless protection on both sides. You know, developing a good working relationship, those are such easy words to say. Good working relationship. I mean, it just kind of flows out of your mouth, doesn't it? And it sounds so good. But if any of you guys have maintained relationships, it's hard work. I mean, it is incredibly hard work. Easy words to say, it's very hard work. And so we have been in good communication. We have, you know, we try to have annual meetings, and I think the kind of relationship that Carrie and Chib forged in thinking first about resources, always putting the resource first, and setting aside all of the politics, just always staying focused on the resource, ensured that we had protection for grizzly bears, that we had protection for natural resources. And, you know, I think that's the key to it, to just always make sure that we put the resource first. So, Todd Mann, give Carrie one of these, would you? I also brought a couple of brief histories of the Salish and Ponderay tribes, developing a good working relationship. Right here, honey. Yes.
Getting back to the issue of fire, can you more elaborately describe what the conflict looked like when you had those cultural ideas about fire, and how you were saying, you know, your culture was constructive with it, and then the Eastern culture saw it as destructive, and you were saying something about how that kind of sculpted the landscape in a negative way. What did you kind of mean by that, I guess?
Okay, great question. More specificity about tribal use of fire. Did I mention that I really love talking about fire? Todd Mann, bring her a reg, would you please? Thank you. Good question. So, when I first began to, I was working at the Salish Pend Oreille Culture Committee, as Carrie said. And one of the things that I realized traveling with elders out onto the landscape on a place names project, and this is really important because place names are some of the oldest words in our language. Like in English, we call it archaic language. We have places like Stevensville and Phillipsburg. These are, some of the oldest place names in Montana in English. And we no longer use burg and we no longer use ville in typical language, but the place names have remained the same over time. And one of the important keys to our relationship between people and place and the resources on the land is identifying place names in our Aboriginal territory. So the Culture Committee traveled with elders across the land and began to explore place names, places that were either parts of coyote stories that described how the land was formed or the resources that were there. There were all kinds of place names. And one of the things I began to realize is that the elders that were sometimes returning after 60 or 70 or 80 years to a place were no longer recognizing these places. And there were places in our language that translated to be the burned over place, or Big Prairie, a series of meadows that were once huge meadows with big pine trees that had all grown up. That looked very different. So I asked the elders everything they could tell me about fire. I mean, I just tortured them relentlessly. Could you talk to me about fire, please? And read everything I could in our oral histories. And what I began to believe is that there was a potent collision of cultures, that tribal people used fire, that this is a fire-dependent landscape. There are places on the land that mosaics that are created for grizzly bears that only fire can create. There are cones that are opened through fire. There are fire plays a hugely important. There are places where 25 years after fire, huckleberries grow up and there's a richness. There are places where trails were maintained and opened by fire. And as I said, I believe that when the first visitors and strangers came, they came with a fear of fire. And when you read the early journals, Lewis and Clark journals, other fur trader and trapper journals, you see that Indians, fire, and wolves were all really scary to them, to the visitors and strangers that came here. And again, they came from a different landscape and a different environment, a built environment rather than a natural environment. So there was this potent collision of cultures, and there was a profound desire by the dominant culture to eliminate fire from the landscape. There's an article in the Missoula Pioneer, the predecessor of the Missoulian, in the late 1800s. I believe it was 1889, in November of 1889, and the headline was "Pesky Redskins." And it was the story of a group of Pend Oreille people that were coming back across the Canadian line after hunting in the plains of Canada, and they were crossing over through the glacier area, and they were shot and killed at the border at the Canadian line for setting fire to the plains when they were leaving. So there were some fairly powerful disincentives that were in place by the government, by early homesteaders and settlers to discourage traditional use of fire. So the collision of cultures resulted in tribal people no longer setting large-scale ecosystem-scale fire. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess you're saying that it changed, I guess, the balance of land management.
Profoundly
From your
changed.
culture to the Eastern culture.
Yes, we saw a period of fire exclusion on the land, and the consequences of it now are beginning to be very apparent to land managers. This is a fire-shaped and fire-dependent landscape, and as tribal people, we're really fire-dependent species. We rely on the grasses, the abundant grasses that come after fire, that that feed the deer and elk and all of the other animals that we rely on, that clear away the brush and provide fertile seed beds and have layers of ash fertilizer for the plants that are important for our foods and our medicines. So we're a very dependent species, those of us that are tribal people in the Northern Rockies. And as a consequence of fire exclusion, there's been it's been a tremendously changed landscape,
So a loss
out of balance.
A loss of diversity and production and things like that.
Yes, yes. In the back.
I was wondering, what's the procedure for gaining access to the tribal lands for, say, backpacking or hunting? And are there any special restrictions put on non-Native Americans to use the land?
Great question. Todd, you're going to give him a set. All the information you want is right there in our regulations. Yes, great question. Question about regulations. You got one. Thank you. Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
The regulations came out of Ordinance 44. There was 44A, B, C, and now we're at 44D. And these are regulations that are tribal law that are ways that we manage the landscape. You didn't know you were going to get your exercise tonight, did you?
I was wondering, now that we're beginning to realize the importance of fire after how many years, like what would you recommend for getting over the barrier of the fire suppression? Like I know there's been a lot of talk, especially in wilderness areas, of whether or not to let fires burn because they're afraid of catastrophic fires, and then Healthy Forest initiatives trying to offset that. So what would you recommend?
Thank you very much. A great question about how we deal with the fear of catastrophic fire as a consequence of fire exclusion for a long time, and all of the policies that are in place now, like Healthy Forest Initiative, and how all of those affect fire potential in wilderness. It is, as I said, it's not as easy as just flipping the switch off and then flipping it back on and putting fire on the landscape. As a consequence of fire exclusion, we're no longer having low intensity, high frequency fire. We're seeing fire behavior that's different than any fire behavior we've ever seen before. And I should probably say, first of all, I'm not a fire scientist. This is a great question to ask fire scientists. I'm an educator. I'm like Dr. Science. I'm not I'm really not a doctor. I'm really not a fire scientist. But we're working on a fire education project, and I think that we're beginning to educate people about the need to restore fire to the landscape. That fear of fire and going off to war to fight fire in a military style maybe isn't the most effective way of thinking about fire on the landscape. We might want to reconfigure how we think about fire. Yes, right behind Deb.
I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about your fire education plan and what you guys are doing.
Oh, did I mention that I like to talk about fire? Todd, man, give her regs, please. Okay, great, thank you. I began serving as a cultural resource. I began serving in cultural resources on fire in the 90s, and what I realized at that point was that there's very little communication about fire at that point, and no information about tribal use of fire historically. So I wrote a proposal and got some funding. I captured some funding from the National Interagency Fire Center to develop an education project, and there are 4 components of it. The first is a coyote story. It's an illustrated children's storybook for children of all ages about, and it tells the story of Beaver Steel's fire. The second component is an iconographic video. So we bring pictures from the storybook, and we also have shot a video with a fluent speaker in Salish and a group of children telling the story of Beaver Steel's fire. And the third piece is an interactive DVD that has interviews with tribal elders and interviews with fire managers. There's a primer on fire ecology and fire science, and there's also, we'll have the storybook there in English and in Salish. You can listen to it and read it. And then the fourth piece is a website where we'll include information like the forest management plan, and we'll also have real-time fire information. Yeah, so that's a little bit. Carrie, yes.
This is a question that doesn't have anything to do with fire.
Oh, good. Is it going to be about wilderness?
Yes.
Are we here to talk about wilderness?
Yes. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the different management proposals that would alter the status quo of how the buffer zone has been managed, and what implications these potential actions have on keeping the wild in the tribal portion of the Mission Mountain Wilderness.
Holy smokes. Okay, so she asked the trick question, the stump the speaker question. Carrie wants to know about the kinds of actions or management policy that has occurred that impacts the buffer zone and other management policies that have been developed, like the fire management policy, the grizzly bear management, or grizzly bear closure, and also the buffer zone. One of the things that's happening right now is Lake County is meeting with tribal government and the community to develop density planning. And, you know, I don't know why it is that county planning hurts so much, but it just hurts the county to think about it and to talk about it. And they have been extraordinarily resistant to density planning and thinking, particularly in areas that are very sensitive. So that's, you know, the lack of planning in for non-tribal lands in the buffer zone. I think that's an issue that's of concern to the tribes. Chip, can you think of other issues or concerns that that are coming up now that have an impact to the either the buffer zone or the wilderness?
What about the timber sale proposals?
Oh, yes. Well, once again, the tribes have proposed logging in the buffer zone, and that's been an issue that's now being discussed with the tribal membership. There's a NEPA process that has been engaged, and there have been a series of community meetings, and the tribe is deeply divided. There are the traditionalists that are very opposed to large-scale timber harvest in the missions, but there's also an interest in hazard fuel reduction and looking at ways that that the buffer zone can be made safe, and there can be a higher level of protection provided for structures and for people, for human health and safety in the buffer zone. It's again, it's a loaded area. We have heavy fuel loading in the buffer zone, and we've called the missions the asbestos forest, but that's only good for so long. And we're kind of conspicuous because in 2000 and 2003 we had fire all around us. So we need to do some hazard fuel reduction, whether or not that means carte blanche and we have large-scale timber harvest in the buffer zone. We're still in discussion about that, but that's a real issue that's before the tribes and the tribal council. Lori, do you get to ask questions?
Germaine, something that we talked a lot about is how when wilderness is designated, it changes people's relationship to that place sometimes. And there's a critique of wilderness that when wilderness is set aside, it becomes a place where people don't go. Critics think that that's maybe inappropriate, that makes wilderness a little bit inappropriate because it becomes this hands-off area, et cetera, both from people that feel like that's ignoring the human history of the area and from people that want to humanize that area in other ways. And what I'm wondering is, with the designation of the tribal wilderness, do you think that changed tribal members' relationship with the Mission Mountains? Do you think with that designation it made it a place where people didn't go as much, or do you think that people maybe go there more now? Or was there a change with the designation of that place as a wilderness?
That's a great question, Lori, about how the designation of Mission Mountains Tribal Wilderness changed the relationship between people and the landscape. And what I hope I conveyed tonight is that this is a wilderness, but it's a tribal wilderness. There's a wonderful word in our language that translates something like this: it's exactly the same, just a little bit different. You know? So tribal wilderness is exactly the same, but it's just a little bit different than federal wilderness. And so the way we manage the wilderness is not the same way that people manage federal wilderness. If our wildlife managers believe that the most expedient way to get into the wilderness to do a grizzly bear count is by helicopter, we fly the bird up into the wilderness. That's very different than federal wilderness. I think that it takes an act of Congress to get a helicopter into the wilderness. I mean, you know, we think about the least disturbance, but that doesn't prohibit active management and active use in the wilderness. This is our land, and this is a land that is not a separate or other. Wilderness is not, does not have the same, I think, division between people and place. I read an interesting article by, what was his name? Cronin. I think I might have it here. William Cronin. Some of you have probably read this, The Trouble with Wilderness, or Getting Back to the Wrong Wilderness. And it's interesting how he frames the history between non-tribal people and wilderness. And it's a whole curious series of differing relationships over time. And I think that for tribal people, it's not, there hasn't been that separation from the natural world. I think one of the ways that we have maintained our cultural identity and have maintained intact as tribal people on the land is that we have, for thousands of years, we've been in approximately the same place. I mean, our land base has been significantly reduced, but we're still in the same place. So Chib's ancestors 26 generations ago, and my ancestors 26 generations ago, or 32 generations ago, because I am older than him, were probably, you know, they probably had overlapping conversations in the same way that we continue to have conversations today. And so there isn't that, there hasn't been that fleeing to urban areas or that separation from people from the land, and it's not, there isn't that same notion that civilization destroys wilderness, but it's wilderness that will save civilization. I mean, there isn't that sort of confusion, or it's not confusion, it's that there isn't that parallel among tribal people in the Mission Mountains wilderness, I believe. Great questions. Oh, another. Yes.
It's kind of a two-part question I've got. The first question I have is that, certainly from what I've seen traveling around the West, there don't seem to be a whole bunch of wilderness areas on tribally designated reservations. And if you could give me some insight onto why you think that is, and also how much education and how much disconnect from the wilderness areas there for the younger generation in the Indian tribes. And I know that a lot of the urban population, there's a lot of disconnect with the younger generations and the minority generations, things like that. I was wondering what it's like on the Kootenai reservation.
Great question. Lots of parts to it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the first part of your question, you know, because I'm kind of a one-trick pony. I'm just going to track the first part and go with that. But so you asked, my thinking about other tribal wildernesses. And, you know, I had a sneaky feeling that somebody was going to ask about that tonight. So I Googled tribal wilderness and Indian wilderness and everything I could think of to get information about it. And I talked with our former wilderness manager and our current wilderness manager. And Taos Pueblo in New Mexico has worked on establishment of a wilderness-like management area for the Blue Mountains, Blue Lake area, and that's proposed, and I don't know what state that's in now. And at one point, apparently there were some lands on Wind River Reservation that were proposed for wilderness. Additionally, some of the First Nations people in Canada have been very progressive about establishing tribal wildernesses, and you know, I can't tell you why other tribes have or have not established wilderness. Heck, I can barely talk for our tribes. You know, I mean, there are so many different ways of thinking about tribal wilderness, but I just feel that the establishment of the Mission Mountains Tribal Wilderness was extraordinarily unique. And what was so profoundly unique about it was that it really came out of a tribal way of thinking, that it wasn't separation of people from landscape, or, you know, it was a continuation of traditional relationship with the land and with this area in particular, and maintenance of cultural and spiritual values. So the tribes, informed by the culture bearers, really felt it was really felt it was essential and necessary to maintain an area in a way that we could have all of the elements of spiritual, necessary for spiritual practice, that there could be solitude, a pristine environment, all of those kinds of things. So again, I really can't speak for other tribes, but for us, I think that it was an expression of who we are as tribal people. Yes?
When you talked about setting aside the wilderness area with the impetus for protecting the grizzly, is there any talk in those discussions since you were there about setting aside a place for buffalo?
You know, we did that. and then the bison were removed, and then they were returned, and we formed the National Bison Range. So we have kind of a curious relationship with bison, but it is long, and it is, we do have a very long relationship with bison. And, you know, we have recently talked about reestablishing a closer management relationship with bison on our reservation. Oh man, you're just going right to the hot political. We're going to move right along. Yes, sir.
There's a primitive area, the South Fork Jocko primitive area, just south of the wilderness, that like the wilderness, has many strict regulations on natural resource access and use. I was hoping that you could talk a bit about the values for which that area was designated and is managed, and then how those values differ from the values that the wilderness area was designated and managed for.
Great question. He asked about the South Fork of the Jocko primitive area. You know, I wasn't going to talk about the South Fork. And, you know, I said there's a word in our language that says it's exactly the same, just a little bit different. For us, the South Fork of the Jocko is a continuation of the Mission Mountains Tribal Wilderness, but because it has some very unique attributes, because there's some of the oldest trails that we know, there are some of the oldest camps, there are, you know, there's abundant animals, the water's clean there, the air is good there, it's a big place. The elders traveled there to gather an abundance of foods and medicines, and they didn't want, there were many places on the reservation where you couldn't go and gather foods and medicines that hadn't been sprayed by chemicals or hadn't been treated or hadn't been fenced off. And so the culture bearers really wanted an area that they could have for their exclusive cultural use. And so the unique difference between the South Fork of the Jocko Primitive Area and the Mission Mountains Wilderness Area is that the South Fork of the Jocko is closed to non-members, and the wilderness area is open to tribal members with a recreation permit.
Was that designated before the wilderness area was created, or was that something that occurred after, or simultaneously?
You know, it's really interesting. There was this. I'm stalling for time to think if I can conjure up the establishment. We just passed the. You know, there was a referendum. It came to the people, and then there was council action. So there were two different pieces of legislation that established the South Fork of the Jocko Primitive Area. And last year we celebrated 25 or 30 years. So it was approximately the same time. You know, it was in the ballpark of the same time. There was a real quickening, and you know, in the 70s there was an interesting thing that was happening across the nation after the 50s, when there was a relocation program that was established by the federal government to try to assimilate tribal people into the dominant culture and for them to establish some kind of socioeconomic success. The federal government established a program of relocation, which was to move tribal people from rural reservation areas, to separate them from their history, their language, and their culture, and to plop them down into large urban areas. So there was a lot of movement from young tribal people off the reservation to places like San Francisco, Chicago. It wasn't very successful. Most people moved home when they had the first opportunity, but there was a real desire to separate tribal people from their culture. And in the early 70s, there was, in the late 60s, there was AIM, American Indian Movement, and a real resurgence of interest in tribal culture and language and history. And many of the traditional cultural bearers realized that their children were not able to speak to their grandparents, that there was a significant loss of language, and the stories weren't being passed on. There was this huge divide between the traditional culture bearers and young people, and so there was an intensity in desire to really retain language and culture and history. So there were lots of forces at play during that late 60s, early 70s, and you know, it was just a quickening. And for us at home, these are some of the things that happened, I think, out of that. Did I answer your question? Tough question. Okay. I'm going to take one of these. Yes, sir.
I was just curious about the elder politics. I was wondering if politics still is similar on the reservation today, and how much influence the elders still have.
That's a great question. I'm going to try to answer the question about what the role of traditional culture bearers is now. Is that the essence of your question? What role do tribal elders and culture bearers have?
Wondering also if they had any more influence in environmental concerns also.
Great.
Yes, how much did the elders?
You know, with the restructuring of tribal government with the IRA, with the Indian Reorganization Act, there was a profound switch in tribal government. But once again, in the early 70s, as I said, many of the middle-aged people were very concerned about the loss of culture and history and language. And they came together and they met with the elders and said, we're very concerned. And the elders felt a huge sense of relief because they had been carrying around this, you know, what was like the Vatican treasury. They were carrying around all of our stories and this huge wealth of information for the tribes. And they were looking for some place to pass this treasure, and they were carrying this extraordinary burden of responsibility with them to, you know, to pass this information on to future generations. And the young people weren't showing up. So it was an extraordinarily difficult time. And these very wise middle-aged people decided that they would turn on a tape recorder. And this was in 1974. And they began to record all of the stories of the elders. And the elders felt such an incredible sense of relief to begin to tell these stories. And over time, the tribal government realized how important this was and formalized that process and established two cultures, because Salish and Pend d'Oreille are sister bands. We're Salish people, and Kootenai are a separate band. And so we formed two culture committees, a Salish Pend d'Oreille culture committee and a Kootenai culture committee, that are specifically charged with maintenance and restoration of our language and our history and our culture. And these culture committees serve as representatives to elders' councils. And every month the elders' councils meet, except in the summertime when we go off and celebrate and go to celebrations and powwows across the country. But most of the rest of the time, the elders come together and provide guidance and direction. They provide that cultural integrity to the tribal government. So when you look at our organizational chart, it looks like lots of other governments' organization charts. We have a tribal chairman, it's like the president, and then we have the cabinet, all of the councilmen represented from the different districts, and then we have an executive treasurer, an executive secretary, and then all of the departments like the Natural Resources Department and Education Department. But the unique thing is we have two little blips on each side of the organizational chart, and one blip are the attorneys. They're our contemporary warriors, and they advise the tribal council. And on the other side, the other little blip, are our culture committees, and they advise our tribal council. So while we no longer have chiefs, we still have these large councils of traditional culture bearers that advise our tribal government. And I'm really middle-aged, so I hold a great deal of respect for our elders, and most people my generation, hold them in great veneration because of the knowledge that they have. I don't know about the young people, if they're as respectful.
So did the whole event of creating the Mission Wilderness, did it also change the political culture of the tribe?
I wish we had time for a follow-up question, but I'm going to punt here to Lori.
Germaine, thank you so much.
Thank you. You guys have been great. Len Lynch.